Hey Fly Tires, welcome back. I'm Matt, thanks for stopping by. Now I got a pretty fun pattern for you today. This one's called the Brown Bivisible. Now it was created by a guy named Ed Hewitt who came from New Jersey, came from a pretty wealthy family, but he was a well-known fisherman, author, and a pretty established conservationist. Now one of his books, Telling on the Trout in 1926, he does talk about this bivisible pattern. And he talks about the genesis of this pattern and that it's pretty well known that a trout looking up to the surface can see a big brown fly, but a fisherman looking down on the surface can't necessarily see it, so he just put a little bit of white hackle on it. He called it a wisp of white hackle up front. Now there are a couple of options of how you can tie this, and it's in many books out there. The most recent one, David Klausmeyer's Favorite Flies. Now his version in here is just a little bit different from Mike Valla's in his classic tying Catskill style flies. So one of the first differences are the tails. You know, a lot of folks will tie this without a tail at all. Mike Valla tied it with brown hackle fibers for a tail, and then whoever tied it for Klausmeyer's book here used hackle tips. Now I kind of like the hackle tips, so I think the one I'm going to do tonight is going to have the tips on it. And in Klausmeyer's book, he talks about wrapping 3 brown hackles, and Mike Valla says you're going to use 2, maybe even 1 if you've got some really good hackle. So I wrapped it with 2, and I just don't see how you could get a third one in there because it was pretty full with just 2. And then both books just, you know, have 4 or 5 wraps of a white dry fly hackle at the front. That's pretty much the defining characteristic of this pattern is the bulk of it is a brown hackled body with the white hackle up front, just to make it a little bit easier for us to see it. So that's it for the fly. You know, developed sometime before Hewitt's book in 1926. It's been a pretty popular and effective fly for almost the next 100 years. Not too hard to tie. I think you're gonna like it. Let's give it a shot. So there's one in the vise, the Brown Bivisible, and this one does not have a tail. And all the ones I've ever tied in the past, I did not put a tail on them, but in Klausmeyer's book, he did have some with a tail, and I thought it looked pretty cool. So this one I'm going to tie right now. Let's add the tail, see how it looks. So that's a size 12, 1X long dry fly hook. I'm going to use 70 denier black, and I'm going to lay a base all the way down to the bend. Now is where we tie in the tail. Now Mike Valla did have a couple of pictures of ones with tails, and it was just brown hackle fibers, but I really liked Klausmeyer's. He had the tips, and Mike Valla did mention tips that lots of folks use them, and you want them about a body length. So I have tried to strip as much of that off as I can just because I want to keep the smooth underbody, but I don't think I got enough of them off in this case. That's the length of the tail I want. I'm just going to bury these in and try to keep this body smooth. Alright, that's going to be fine, because we've got a big stem for the brown hackle that we're going to put on here in just a second. Go ahead and snip that off. Now the brown hackle, we're going to, well, take your thread to where you want the brown to stop. That's the front part of where we want the brown to be. So I've got two brown hackle dry fly feathers. I've stripped them off down to where there's no more webbing on them. And I'm going to line them up, get them lined up. And you could probably, if you've got some really good dry fly hackle, you can probably do this with 1. But I'm going to go by Mike Valla's recipe and do it with 2. So where that thread is hanging is where the front of my brown is going to be. So I'm going to catch this in right here. We'll just do 2 wraps to check it because I'd like a little bit of bare stem showing when I wrap that first wrap. So I'm going to just pull it up just a little bit. There we go. And now I'm going to capture this in tightly all the way back. Now before I get too far back, I'm going to reach in here and snip these off right there where the back of the hackling is going to come. So trying to keep my body smooth right here. So we had that little bit of lump with the tail fibers, but I think this will help us balance it out. Watch the point of your hook back here. Okay, and that is where I'm going to end my hackle. So what we do here, we're going to wrap these. Notice I'm not going to pull them down and open them up. I'm going to wrap them with, this one is actually, I probably should have it the other way because it looks like the shiny side is back, and I think it would look better forward. So here's a tip. Whichever side is getting compressed against the hook, you want to keep that side always facing the hook. Try not to let the feather spin around on you, and then that way just pretty much one wrap right behind the other. And if you can keep that configuration all the way back, your fibers should, for the most part, stay coming out perpendicular to the hook. Okay, now when you get to the back, let's put 2 wraps to catch this and secure this. And that hackle right there is probably enough. This is pretty decent dry fly hackle. It's a whiting, high and dry. But I'm going to try and wrap one more through it and try not to capture too many of these. So I've got this other one right here. I could probably just leave it right there and it's going to be a fine fishable fly. But I'm trying to stick a little bit closer to the original, so I'm going to wrap this other one all the way back and just try to zigzag it through a little bit. Same configuration as before, don't let it spin on you, but try not to trap too many. You might trap a few, but that's okay. Just take it all the way back to where we stopped wrapping that first one. Okay, now let's catch this one off with 2 wraps right here. Kind of zigzagging it through so I don't trap too many of them. Now you could go ahead and cut them off right now, but you might risk one of them popping out, so I'm just going to go ahead and take my thread back up front. And this one, just take your time and zigzag it through here. This is going to really lock these 2 hackle feathers in. Okay, now I've got it up front. I'm just going to push these back. I don't like those leaning forward too much, so I'm going to pull them back and just put a couple of wraps right in front of them to try to prop them back upright. Don't get them swept back. You don't want them pointing back. Just kind of still perpendicular. And I think we're fine right there. I'm going to reach in here and then snip these fibers off as close as I can get without messing up any of the other fibers. Okay, I think that's fine right there. Now we've got one more component, the white hackle up front. Now I'm just going to put a few wraps right here to make sure I have a smooth base to wrap this white hackle on. And I think that's fine right there. So just some white dry fly hackle. And my white hackle is not as high quality. This is not a whiting, so it's not as nice as the brown I just put on, but we can get away with it. So I'm just going to kind of lay it right here in the middle. And then, you know, if you need to spin your thread counterclockwise to have it jump back, go ahead and do that. You see how I kind of starting it right up in the middle of that brown so that my first wraps are going to be right up next to that brown. You don't want a gap between your brown and your white. So let's snip that off. I'm going to have a little step right there. I'm going to try to smooth that out so that my base is fairly smooth. And that is probably, I'm probably not even going to wrap that white that far forward. And depending on the quality of your hackle will determine how many wraps you need. This one I might need, you know, 5 wraps or so. The original directions call for a wisp of white at the front. So I guess a wisp is open for interpretation to anybody. So let's put our wisp up here, and I'm going to call a wisp about 5 wraps. There's 2. That was 5. I'm going to try for 6. I might have to push a little bit of this back, but I don't think 5 gave me as much white as I wanted. So let's catch this off with a couple wraps here. And I'm going to go ahead and just push these back before I snip that white. Just try to get a better head before I cut it off. So pull it back and then take your thread right back to the eye and ramp it back up, not too far, just far enough that you've got that white caught in and you've got room for your whip finish. Before I let go, I'm just going to snip these off. Okay. Now we can reach in here and snip this excess white. You can tell this white hackle is not as high quality as that brown, but we'll be able to brush it out and have a decent looking head on this thing. So just pull it back one more time, try to bury those before I do my whip finish. And you don't have to worry about a tiny head on this. It is a true Catskill style fly, but this thing is so buoyant, it's not going to sink. If your head's just a little bit bigger than you like, I wouldn't worry too much about it. So I think I trapped one of those fibers doing my whip finish right there, but we're okay. Now if you got any cleanup, you can take your brush, just make sure you're coming out perpendicular as best as possible. And a drop of head cement and you call it done. So maybe a little cleanup. I got a couple sticking forward, but I'm not going to worry about that. So there you go, Brown Bivisible. I kind of like it with that tail. You know, most of the time I don't tie it with the tail, but I think it looks kind of cool. So that's it, my friends. I appreciate you watching. Y'all take care, and we'll see you next time.